So I am very excited to introduce George Holley, who will speak on listening to pots, or how little things speak volumes. I'm going to turn it over to George at this point. And I think you'll have to unmute yourself, George.
Okay. Sorry, slight difficulty. I regret not giving this in person, although I don't regret the 250 miles I would be driving in this weather. As a ceramicist, and I've been looking at pots for 50 years, like all objective researchers, I try to make sense of it. And by doing that, I impose order on the mess of things that we have in front of us. We use typology, attribute analysis. We measure things, line thickness, wall thickness, all those sorts of things. So we're always imposing order. And it dawned on me that maybe we should listen to what the pots say. And let me give you some examples before I get into the subject at hand, which concerns the little things. I'm going to be talking about the late pre-contact from roughly 1200 to 1400 in Minnesota. And as you can see with this array of Oneota pots, you could say that some cultures like Oneota, right, their pots talk a lot. Every Oneota pot is decorated, which is rather unusual. As I'll also talk about later on, they're probably saying the same thing. Others, for example, Sandy Lake, which is to the north of Oneota, don't seem to talk a lot, or at least tell us things in their pots. And I think we make a mistake with Sandy Lake in that we see it as sort of recidivistic, or looking backwards as opposed to forwards in time. There was no backwards in Minnesota that looked like this. This was in some ways forward, but it's not in a way. I think, to spit it out, I think they're masking competition, if you will. When you polish a pot or smooth it finely and then incise it, you show yourselves, in comparison to others so that people can evaluate. But suppose you clean the slate, so to speak, and didn't have a surface really to compete with. And I think that's something that I'd like to talk about another time, but not this time. Oh, just one other thing about Sandy Lake. When they do decorate, they decorate on the interior. So if you're going to look at anything they do, you've got to get very close. But I'm here to talk about small things. And the small thing that I'm going to talk about are peaks, which are bits of pads of clay, which are modeled into the vessel. And what got me onto this was a collection that was loaned to me by an avocational archaeologist, Craig Coleman, in Otter Tail County. And here is a rim with a peak. And it's stimulated me to remember all the other peaks I've seen across Minnesota, and I finally felt I had to do something about them. As you can see here, this is an array of peaks from Minnesota. There are quite a lot, and most of them exist within a period from the time I'm talking about, 1200 to 1400. I first noticed them in Red Wing area during what I call the link phase, which is transitional between Silvernail and Bartrone Oneota. And there were quite a few vessels with these peaks. It got me again to thinking about peaks. But I'll sidestep peaks for a second, but yet come back to it. And that's this peak that appears on link style pots. And link style is a style I've started to develop to look at specific kinds of pots made in Minnesota. I show on the right here a rattlesnake gorget from Tennessee, only to remind me to mention that in the southeastern United States, we have innumerable style groups for shell gorgets, for pots, for you name it. But in the upper Midwestern plains, there are really no style groups. So I thought maybe we should be talking about style groups, and link style is one of the ones I want to propose, and it deals with a peak. Now, everybody knows about the link pot here. It's a symbol for Minnesota archaeology. And everybody knows also that it encodes or it speaks about Thunderbird. In fact, the link pot is a good example of a skenectiki, which is a difficult word to pronounce, but it means that you could see a part of a motif and realize the whole motif was there. So for example, here's our, I'll give you an exploded view. Here is our Thunderbird. And you see a Oneota example, which also has a spotted breast. In the plains, people think of the spotted breast when it's shown in rock art as indicating hail brought by the Thunderbird. But actually, I think it's related to the immature bald eagle, which has spotted, speckled look. There's also the tail, which appears widely across the Midwest. I'm showing you an example from Cahokia, predating Sterling, which is about 1000 AD. So this is a good 200 years before the link style. And to restate, link style is just part of the Thunderbird complex. And we have the cloaca, which is an important element, which I'll get into. And finally, the wings themselves, which are usually shown as hatchers or straight lines. So you can see that the Thunderbird has encapsulated within it all of the pieces, or many of the pieces that are reconfigured throughout the Midwest, in sometimes in Cahokia Horizon and definitely in Oneota. Now, one element that's not shown in Oneota, not reproduced, and that is this quixotic, mysterious element of the link pot. And it's been interpreted in various ways. A comet, lightning, even a underwater spirit, which in many stories, the upper sky Thunderbird conflicts with the lower world spirit. But actually, a student who was working with me, I think, gave the best idea. And this is B. Frank, and she was charged with drawing the pots, all of different pots of the link style. And it was her idea that when she looked at the pot, that the cloaca of the Thunderbird has the same kind of punctation as this squiggly element. And if you look at the other punctations, they are typically ovoid. Most Oneota punctations are like this, and I think they depict feathers. But she wondered then, is this lightning bolt, this squiggly element, is it something sexual? And if we can think about it a little further, does it mean something about life and Thunderbird bringing life? And I'll explore this, but not forgetting about peaks. I found the link style, or at least vessels I attribute to the link style, from 4 different locations throughout southern Minnesota. One recently found by Ron Shermer at the Vosburg site in Blue Earth, has a peak, I might notice, and a Thunderbird, which has the squiggly elements and somewhat different, but a little more abstract Thunderbird. I do want to point out also that the peak is often located above an important part of the design. So it's strategic, if you will. And there's also usually 4 of them, recognizing the 4 cardinal directions. To go back to the link pot, the peak is associated with that squiggly element and not the Thunderbird. Another pot, maybe earlier in time, grid tempered from Cambria, has the Thunderbird and the lightning squiggly, but no cloaca. But I still think the lightning element is central here, or this squiggly element is central, and that's the central part of the link pot style. And finally, there is a pot from Lou Miller Mound moving up the Minnesota River from Cambria, and it has simply just one part of this whole complex link style, and that is the, if you will, the squiggly element. Also has a punctation at the same spot as in the link pot. And while they don't have peaks, they do have interesting handles that are peak-like. They're, if you will, peaked handles. Now, if I go outside of this link style, and again, remember the link phase and Red Wing, there are a lot of pots with peaks. It's important to state here that just because a pot has a peak doesn't mean it's a very significant pot. But I think all significant pots that are trying to tell us something, a lot of things have peaks. As I move west, into where I see peaks and a lot of peaks. Notice if I go, if I go south, I don't get peaks. If I go east, I don't get peaks. If I go north, I don't get peaks. I have to go west to find a substantial number of peaks at roughly the same time. And here are some examples from an initial Middle Missouri site in South Dakota, the Mitchell site, and also from the Cheyenne Bend region with fancy pots with peaks. A little later in time, extended Middle Missouri on the Missouri River, you find pots with peaks. And later in time in the Cheyenne Bend region, here's a pot with peaks. And here we have, how should I say, a sort of abstract Thunderbird motifs. And again, going further north, staying roughly in the same time, there is a style of pots called the Sourceford style in North Dakota and Manitoba, associated with the Sourceford River. And here are two pots that I think are interesting in this discussion of peaks and the link style. This pot has 4 Thunderbirds depicted. It has the cloaca depicted, as well as perhaps these bent wings indicate the forces emanating from the Thunderbird, but I'm not sure about that, so I don't call it the link style, although it shares a lot. And this pot has a Thunderbird, doesn't have peaks, so it's not part of the link style really, but yet it has something fascinating. It has, instead of peaks, it has salamanders peeking out of the vessel. And this observation came from another student I worked with, Jamie Joos, who published this in the Plains Anthropologist. She noted that these salamanders appear out of the ground when spring comes. In fact, you see lots of them all around in the northern plains. So what great idea here is that the peaks are salamanders and the salamanders are emerging from the ground. Well, it doesn't take me much to make 1 and 1 is 2 in this case. And I'll elaborate. But finally, to finish this tour of peaks and Thunderbird related motifs, I have to go, or I can go way north to, I think, the northernmost, and that is at the Lockport site on the Red River north of Winnipeg. And here you have peaks and Thunderbird related motifs. Not the link style, but nevertheless, that association is important. When I look at the Middle Missouri River, though, for decorated pots, you don't have the Thunderbird motif. You have something else that has somewhat similar arrangements in terms of chevrons and triangles. In this case, here you're looking at a pot that's extended Middle Missouri from the Paul Brave site that has what are called bear claw motifs. And it is also peaked, interesting enough, has a peaked handle. Sorry, oh, wrong way. Another vessel from the Middle Missouri region, bear claw and peak. So in summary, I see peaks as the triangles that project or rise above the horizon. They rise above the level of the orifice. And notice here, this spiral, spiral scroll is associated with the peak on this vessel from the Red Wing area. And triangles are interesting because I see it as the basis for the Thunderbird. It's hard to imagine a Thunderbird being drawn without having a triangle somewhere in it, as I've tried to play around with the different colors here. So triangles are really essential for Thunderbirds, and judging by the bear pots from the extended Middle Missouri out further west, it's also important for bears. Bear, Thunderbird. Odd, I would have never made that association. Now, the people I've been talking about in the area I've been talking about is sort of shown in this large circle, roughly from AD 1200 to 1400. It's fascinating that across this wide area, where of course we're going across different linguistic groups, different adaptations, different archaeological cultures, if you will. Oneota is quite different from Middle Missouri and Northeast Plains. They're all different, but yet they're all doing kind of the same thing. And I think what that thing is that they're doing is that they are celebrating spring renewal or the renewal of life every year. And the peaks are really like plants emerging from the ground or life emerging from the ground. And so the Thunderbird in link style has peaks, and the peaks are associated with the, at least visually, with this element that is representing perhaps life force. So the Thunderbirds in many plains groups think, of course, bring rain in spring, but rain begins the ritual cycle. Rain begins life anew, the spring rain, the thunder associated with spring rain. Salamanders, as we've seen in the northern plains, emerge from the ground in spring. Bears, interestingly enough, of course, emerge from dens in spring. So all of this life is emerging. And I think the people who lived in that area that I drew are seeing, and it's talking about the same thing, using the same element, that is the peak. And that is, I think, amazing. And it also points to the importance, philosophical importance, if you will, for Native peoples, for the renewal of life. And I think we should begin to rethink Oneota as often seen as aggressive people who, the Thunderbird is a martial creature who brings destruction on their enemies, but actually the Thunderbird is bringer of life, and life renewed every year. Done. Thanks.